I'm delighted to have been invited by the Humanities and Social Change Centre to give a response to this important lecture series. Professor Axel Honneth offers us a vital argument for our times when he asks, how can we critique unacceptable working conditions when the ideological backdrop to the experience of work means that people struggle to articulate the harms done to them by present working arrangements, with the consequence that they cannot form the solidaristic basis for resisting these working conditions? Axel describes how work derives its value from its contribution to the capacity of people to participate in democratic will formation. Moreover, he's rightly concerned with what is realistic and possible to achieve right now, given the urgencies of technological change that degrades working conditions and threatens the elimination of work as a collective endeavour. This is an attractive project. However, I do have some concerns regarding Axel's treatment of meaningful work that I think have implications for his overall aims, and it's these concerns I shall discuss. Firstly, Axel dismisses meaningful work as a too demanding ideal that cannot be fully realised in all kinds of work, and so is not useful for critiquing already existing working conditions. However, I think this move neglects what Dorothy Emmett calls the role of the unrealisable, or the contribution that regulatory ideals make to our choices and our actions. Secondly, Axel relies upon a concept of meaningful work as non-alienated, uncoerced labour that produces intrinsic goods relevant to the individual worker. But more recent concepts of meaningful work draw upon relational accounts of meaningfulness, where the meaning content of work is co-constructed in public arenas of work. In such conceptions, meaningful work involves the co-production of collective activities that are judged to be worth doing, aim at valuable purposes, and are emotionally attractive. Conceptualized this way, meaningful work becomes an important resource in its own right for supporting Axel's project, and especially in developing his account of the instrumental value of work as consisting in its contribution to democratic will formation. So I propose to retrieve meaningful work as a regulatory ideal. Meaningful work, informed by the moral value of meaningfulness, occupies a distinct presence in the normative landscape. It's not just work that is satisfying for the individual, a kind of faded image of non-alienated creative activity. Drawing upon the moral philosophy of Susan Wolfe, the moral value of meaningfulness is distinguished from duty or utility. This value describes how subjective attachment to objectively valuable beings and things is a source of vital motivation and life identity. And when combined with recent accounts of interpersonal value systems, such as J. Wallace's moral nexus, meaningfulness has collective, social, and political dimensions. This makes the value of meaningfulness a neglected dimension of human behaviour that could inform work design and public policy. Most people would find it difficult to do without meaning in their lives, and most people want also to experience involvement with beings and things of independent value and moral significance in their working day. Work that lacks consistency with the value of meaningfulness ignores vital aspects of our humanity. Our need for meaning in work cannot easily be remedied elsewhere in our lives because of the continuing importance of work in modern complex societies, despite forecasts of the technological elimination of human work. Axel's critique of meaningful work provides a springboard for his argument that a viable concept of work must be useful in real time for amending unacceptable working conditions, and this is indeed a very important observation. But in dismissing meaningful work as a viable social objective, Axel loses resources that might aid his central argument of the role of work in democratic will formation. Resources that enlarge our political and social imagination, that help us to collectively evaluate what is wrong with the current state of work and to envision what work could and ought to be. Meaningful work does not have to be perfectly realised to play this kind of role. Even in its imperfect presence in work, meaningful work is a useful regulatory ideal for governing and transforming work and for stimulating the range of lives available for us to live. Part of the difficulty is the concept of meaningful work adopted by Axel. This reduces meaningful work to an individualizing, intrinsic notion of work, but more recent accounts describe meaningful work as co-constructed, relational, processual, and collective, where to be meaningful, work must be directed to realizing the good for morally valuable objects, beings, things, projects, etc. This gives meaningful work a public character, requiring activities to be evaluated by their instrumental effects on the world. All work contains emancipatory traces consistent with meaningful work as a regulatory ideal. Such traces are interpretations of the experience of work. They arise from reflections and evaluations of the meaning content of work, what work is, how it is done, what standing it has for people in their lives. In many work settings, and especially when those settings are democratically organized, these interpretations are pre-political potentials that offer dynamic resources for people to be able to make the most of participating in democratic will formation. When these pre-political potentials are activated by worker democracy, they are translated into the meanings we need for understanding, knowledge, and social change. A related point is the important connections between meaningful work and meaningful life. The urge to realize the value of meaningfulness in our work and our lives derives from a fundamental human need to feel that our lives have significance and value. At the root of this need is our shared human nature as patterning, meaning-making creatures. This meaning-making instinct has powered the development of culture, including values, norms, and narratives, underpinning large-scale and now planetary-spanning social cooperation. Meaningfulness becomes a moral value when human beings develop the collective capacity to evaluate desirable and undesirable meanings and patterns of meanings. And it is now especially important to develop such a collective moral capacity. We live in times of political uncertainty when so many settled meaning systems are being disrupted, providing opportunities for those who will construct new meanings and narratives that serve their own interests at the expense of others. This matters not only for critiquing unacceptable working conditions, but also because lacking a sense of life having significance and value lies at the root of some of our most pressing political problems, such as the rise of populism and the capture of anxiety by entrepreneurs of hate. With this in mind, an instrumental conception of meaningful work could be enabling of democratic will formation. Meaningful work as currently understood in the field is processual, relational, and socially constructed using collective and public meanings that are directed to achieving external goods. The meaningfulness of work entails contributive connections to valuable beings and things. And in my own work, I've proposed an ethic of care to evaluate the moral aspects of a whole range of contributive connections afforded by meaningful work, assessing how well things are going for the beings and things that are the target of our activities. Properly conceived and adopted as a regulatory ideal, a relational approach to meaningful work plays an important role in supporting democratic will formation. The pluralism of meaningful work, the varieties of ways in which work can legitimately be meaningful, is part and parcel of the pluralism necessary for democratic will formation. When activated by worker democracy, varieties of meanings provide ethical resources for surfacing the problems we must collectively work upon. Such meanings inhabit the narratives, knowledge, and understanding by which we mobilize around complex problems that are the reasons why we need democratic will formation at all. Furthermore, meaningful work is partly constituted by the collective participatory work of creating and maintaining the organisation as a democratic entity, or indeed any kind of entity, democratic or otherwise. This joint work of socially constructing the life of the organisation is little theorised in critical political theory, but such work of organising can be observed in the real world under conditions of mutual ownership, where mutuality and meaningfulness are roped together, and could provide a reinforcing strand in Axel's argument for the contributive value of work to democratic will formation. This has implications for political action. The moral significance of something cannot be fully understood if it is left to private individual assessment. When constituted by participatory work, meaningful work enables assessments of moral significance to issue in public claims related to objective value, or collective evaluations of what is of worth. And indeed, much democratic will formation is directed at this question of what is of worth. People as workers and citizens have to weigh up what is of value, form judgments, and in the end, make difficult choices. And here, the unrealizable has an important role in real time in actual lives and work. Even imperfectly realized meaningful work, constituted by participatory work, makes an important contribution to the democratic will formation necessary for addressing these questions of worth. And as theorists, we should certainly claim and develop this territory. Because if social reformers abandon meaningful work as too difficult to realize for all occupations and so unhelpful for critiquing unacceptable working conditions, then we leave the field open to management elites and organizational designers. And these groups certainly perceive the potential for meaningful work. They are, as we speak, going to meaningful work to support ideologies that benefit the organization at the expense of workers. And the harms of them doing so are considerable because meaningful work programs tap into more of our humanity than employee engagement initiatives. We also leave the field open to those manipulators of popular opinion who would distort democratic will formation by capturing public meaning systems in order to acquire undue influence over the forms of meaningful life and work we have available to us. But finally, perhaps Axel is right. This is not only unrealistic, but even too burdensome. So I turn to Viktor Frankl and his 1972 speech on life meaning to the Toronto Youth Corps. He says, "If you take man as he really is, we make him worse. But if we overestimate him, we promote him to what he really can be. So we have to be idealist in a way, because then we wind up as the true, the real realist. If we take man as he should be, we make him capable of becoming what he can be. If you don't recognize a young man's will to meaning, you make him worse. You make him dull. You make him frustrated. There must be a spark or a search for meaning. Let's recognize this. Let's presuppose this. And then you will elicit it from him. You will make him become what he is in principle capable of becoming." By giving the organization of work a stretching goal, a demanding regulative ideal such as meaningful work, we not only avoid making work worse, but also promote work to what it could be, a humanizing experience that, whilst not fully realized, nonetheless helps us to participate in imaginative collective determinations of synoikismos, or how we are to live together. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ruth. That was an extremely challenging and thoughtful comment. And I will certainly not be able to answer to all the points and to go through all your extremely interesting arguments. I will reduce myself mainly to conceptual questions, and I hope that is fine, because the conceptual aim was, or to clarify concepts was in the center of my first lecture. Before I do that, let me mention two preliminary things. Namely, first, I agree with you that regulatory ideals have a place in our human life form. I completely agree with that. Without regulatory ideals, as you expressed it very nicely at the end, we would not even develop the motivation to make things better or to aim for progress in the organization of our social life form. So I agree with that. The question there is always whether the regulatory ideals are fit to inform us about what to do today. Yeah? So there must be, let's say, an internal connection between what the regulatory ideal is telling us and whether it informs us about the ends in view. So to put it more abstractly, the final end, regulatory ideals, should be of such a kind that we can derive from them ends in view. And so my question would go in such a direction, but I leave it aside. I agree with you about the place of regulatory ideals within our social life. I also agree, without question and certainly, with the idea that meaningfulness, whatever that exactly means, has a high moral value. Meaninglessness is something we suffer from. If our life has no meaning, or if certain experiences we have to make or certain contexts we are involved in lose their meaning for us, then we are suffering from it, and therefore it has at least a normative relevance to speak on, or to take meaningfulness into view. I agree also with that. So the question with regard to meaningfulness, I think, is centrally in the context we are talking about, is how exactly to apply it to the domain of work. So that's the question that the two of us have to debate. And here I think there are at least two options in the beginning, and I'm not completely clear how you opt with regard to these alternatives. On the one side, we might determine the meaningfulness of work with regard to its purpose. Yeah, it's one way to talk about the meaningfulness of work. We might say, if the purpose of an organization, a work organization or a firm has meaning, is meaningful, then the work or the actions that have to be performed in order to realize the purpose are meaningful too. So that's one alternative, yeah? So the meaningfulness stems from the meaningfulness of the purpose of our actions, and in our special case, the meaningfulness of the labor or the work people have to perform in order to realize the purpose. The other alternative, the second alternative, is to determine meaningfulness with regard to the structure of action. So one wouldn't say that labor becomes meaningful if the purpose it realizes is meaningful, but one would say that the structure of labor is meaningful if it has certain properties. So my guess is that you have a certain tendency to follow or to opt for the first alternative, namely to determine the meaningfulness of work by referring to the purpose. Then it's easy, and you are completely right. One then might say that the purpose is the more meaningful, the more it is cooperatively constructed. You might even go further and say the purpose of a certain organization of work is objectively meaningful if one could demonstrate that it serves good purposes, that it serves the common good, for example. So my guess is, again, that your definition of the meaningful work is mainly relying or referring to the purpose that is realized. I started from the alternative possibility, and that is because I think Marx has mainly the alternative in view, namely to determine the meaningfulness of work by reference to its structure. So one then has to ask, is the structure of the labor, the laboring process in itself, so organized that it bears meaning? Now, surely that's a very difficult question. Yeah, what do we mean when we ask whether a certain kind of labor is meaningful because it has a certain structure, it is organized in a certain form? But I think that the alternative that Marx was following, and to put it in brackets, I took the concept of meaningful as a follow-up concept to Marx's notion of unalienated labor. That is a pre-decision I took that is probably doubtful. And I think you would probably tend to reject that kind of linkage, yeah, between Marx's concept of unalienated labor and the concept of meaningful labor. But if we take that route, and we then have to determine the meaningfulness of work with regard to the structure of the laboring process, then we have, I think, only one option left, namely to propose that labor, the process of labor, the activity of labor, is the more meaningful, the more it is able to realize or to objectify specifically human capacities. I think, as I've heard you now, this kind of idea is relatively absent from your thoughts, because you're mainly concentrating on purpose, yeah, which is, as I'm saying, a meaningful way to go. But it is an alternative way to the route I was taking. So then the question that is obvious is, how do we determine whether a certain type of labor is able to be meaningful because it is capable of realizing specific human capacities? We talked about that in the colloquium, and we talked about it in our lunch seminar. You have two options here, a subjective one and an objective one. I don't want to go into this too deeply, but I think the subjective one is completely irrelevant because it is too weak. Yeah, if we determine meaningfulness of work only by referring to the subjective opinions of people about whether their work is realizing their capacities, we have not a good indicator, I think, because it is too open for ideological influences, to dictatorship, and or to other false consciousness, all these possibilities. So I'm then left, or we are left with the objective point of view, which says labor is only meaningful in its structure, not in its purpose, in its structure, when it is capable of realizing specifically human capacities. So my objection to the concept of meaningful work was mainly addressed to this idea, probably only to this idea. Yeah, I'm believing and I'm convinced that the idea that work has to become meaningful in the objective sense and with regard to its structure, not its purpose, is too burdensome. It is, let's say, a too optimistic view on the possibilities we will have, even in the far future, to reorganize work, because I simply don't believe that all kinds of laboring activities can be organized such that they are objectively capable of expressing or objectifying specifically the human capacities. So that comes then to the point that I think I have a tendency to agree with everything you said, because it would fit into the idea that that labor has a contributive or constitutive value with regard to democratic will formation. And I think most of what you said goes in such a direction. And we might then easily say, the more people are able and allowed to determine collectively the purpose of their laboring activities, the better it is for their democratic capacities. One might even go one step further and say it's almost the same. Yeah, I mean, to determine the purpose of my own laboring activity is almost identical with what we mean when we talk about democracy. Yeah, democracy should allow people to determine even the purposes of their own laboring activities. It is one of their democratic rights to determine those purposes. But my reservation here is that tells you nothing or not a lot about the structural components of those laboring activities. Yeah, we can realize the best purposes by relatively badly organized laboring activities or poorly organized laboring activities. That's the reason I went into the other direction, and I was asking myself whether there is any sufficiently realistic view or allowing a realistic view when we determine meaningfulness of work with reference to its structure and not to its purpose. So my broad answer to what you said in your highly interesting remarks would be more a question. Namely, the question would be, do you think that if we, instead of determining meaningfulness with regard to purposes, we determine it with regard to the structure of activities, whether in such a case, the whole idea is sufficiently informing, is a good regulatory idea. My doubt would be it lacks the realism that is necessary for a regulatory idea to be informative with regard to ends in views. So maybe I'll leave it with that. I mean, again, the main point was the difference between purpose-directed and activity-directed concepts of meaningfulness of work. So thank you very much. Yeah, and as I said already before, that's only the beginning of a long debate that we have to continue.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed this. It's been so great to have a chance to be involved with this. I've enjoyed all of your papers, Axel.
Thank you.
Really interesting. Lots to think about, and thank you to everybody.